This is the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpauir.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
It's morning time recording here.
Pardon me. Good afternoon.
I have the advantage. Or you have the advantage. I guess you're in front of me. You know what happens next. I don't. I'm sitting back there at 11 o'clock.
You appraised.
Yeah. Let me know what's going on.
And we celebrated New Year's Eve in your time zone this year, actually in your city. It was very strange. My grandmother is a night owl, and she called me at 11 p.m. Austin time to wish me a Happy New Year. I haven't experienced that before, having always lived on the same time zone as New York City, which seems to govern these things.
New Year's is a good excuse to be with friends, and so that's welcome. But overall, this whole New Year's is important. I don't get it. Maybe a wonderful time to barbecue, dig a hole in the ground, put some embers in it, put a pig on top of it. That sounds great.
But only if you're from somewhere probably west of Eastern time zone where you can do that in December.
I tell you, living in Phoenix was an experience simply because not only do those people love their guns, they love their fireworks. I've been around a lot of fireworks in my day and in my life, shot my fair share of fireworks. My God. Phoenix, New Year's, insane fireworks, just nonstop. And you're like, isn't all of this going to catch on fire? They don't care. Yeah. It does catch on fire. So you watch the news and there's like, everything's on fire. People still just shooting fireworks. It is wild. And that's a word I've used to describe Phoenix repeatedly. That place is wild. It is fantastic. Driving there is a rite of passage to see whether or not you are alive. Or so you follow some of these places online that are showing accidents in Phoenix. The number of cars that are just upside down and on fire is astounding.
And you lived in some places with some pretty notorious traffic.
Sure. I mean, we lived in Los Angeles for a good amount of time. And yeah, you sitting on the 405, it's terrible. But LA drivers are pretty good, in my opinion. Everybody there knows how to do 75, 80 in close proximity to everyone else. So they know how to drive on the freeways. It's different than the just raw aggression of Phoenix. DC's pretty tough. Boston's pretty tough, but the aggression in Phoenix is unprecedented. It's like every Dodge Ram pickup truck you see is coming for you. So you better go. You better accelerate. Because
the heat.
Yeah, must be the heat. Some people always say this. I've seen comedians discuss this and they're like, yeah, it must be the heat that makes everybody in Phoenix that way. And then other comedians go, no, it's the drugs. Everybody's on drugs. I don't know if that's true. There was a comedian who said that. And so, probably just said it to be funny. But you know what's not funny? The feebleness of the Articles of Confederation. We must understand those now, Aaron.
Yeah.
And I think we're prepared. As we turned in our studies of the Federalist Papers to Federalist 21 and 22, one thing is apparent to me. Publius could not start here. Publius could not start with an all-out assault on the Articles of Confederation, even though he has been critiquing them the whole time. This full critique that comes in Federalist 21 and 22 is something we've earned. Now we have a deeper appreciation of the necessity of the Union to keep us safe from external threats, from internal threats, the beauty of the Union in terms of its ability to cure the effects of majority faction by way of representation in an extended sphere. And then also our study of all of the problems that beleaguered confederacies, both ancient and modern, has us ready to examine our government that we've been living under for the last decade. Now, I would argue, of course, that any student of this stuff would do well to have as a complement to their study of Federalist 21 and 22, Madison's Vices of the Political System of the United States. Now, that was written in April of 1787, and Publius offers us 21 and 22 in December of that year. So we can presume that this mysterious Publius figure was familiar with those arguments there. But nonetheless, there are a handful of capital defects in the articles that Publius wants to address here. And that's what Aaron and I are going to do today.
Yeah, before we take up 21, you and I have both in the past taught vices of the political system of the United States. And it's interesting for how it builds not only a framework for these two essays, 21 and 22, but also for how it shapes some of the prior papers. I mean, the ending of that essay, the longest section of it, is a rehearsal for the argument in Federalist 10 for an extended sphere. You also see, as we shall, the injustice, the mutability of the laws of the several states, and how the national government encourages this weakness, this injustice, as Publius will say in 21 and 22, the imbecility. And when you're reading 21, this picks up immediately. Paragraph 2. The next most palpable defect of the existing confederation is the total want of a sanction to its laws. What is a law? Well, it's something that needs to be enforced. If the Confederation Congress is promulgating decrees that the states and the people within them are not following, then the Confederation Congress's lawmaking power is not at all a lawmaking power. As he said, there is no express delegation of authority to them to use force against delinquent members. And if such a right should be ascribed to the federal head as resulting from the nature of the social compact between the states, it must be by inference and construction in the face of that part of the second article, by which it is declared, quote, that each state shall retain every power, jurisdiction, and right not expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled.
So what becomes the 10th Amendment is here as the second article in the Articles of Confederation. And because this power to enforce the federal laws is not granted to the federal Congress, it can't enforce any of the laws it makes. And as you pointed out, Aaron, a law that lacks teeth, that has no enforcement mechanism, is no law whatsoever. It's a suggestion. It's a request. And that is not sufficient. There must be a compulsory aspect of law. Now, it could be a good law. It could be a law that we assent to, consent to, but law cannot bank on that. And as you've also said, a law that's not followed, we might wonder whether we should ever call it a law. And then finally, can I say this too, Aaron? Whether that government's actually a government. Because if you're a lawmaking body who lacks the power to make laws that can be enforced, you're not a lawmaking body. You're a suggestion-making body. Hey, it might be a good idea for you to get a haircut finally, Aaron. I'm not so sure about that mustache. It's very different from or else. This is where Publius starts in 21, and it is an axiom. It is a truth about law from here to eternity. And since you and I have bought into the necessity of union to keep us safe, we can now see in a newfangled way the inability of the Articles of Confederation to keep us safe.
Yeah, and if we think about our previous conversations about 16 or 17, we have to admit that this problem strikes at the sovereignty of the states, right? That provision that I read from the Articles of Confederation, that each state shall retain every power, jurisdiction, and right not expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. This is an enormous bulwark in the Articles of Confederation for the power of the state governments against the federal head. And Publius admits it's an applauded provision. But if we're unwilling to impair the force of it, we shall be obliged to conclude that the United States afford the extraordinary spectacle of a government destitute even of the shadow of constitutional power to enforce the execution of its own laws. And after all that legwork we did about historical confederations from the Mediterranean, we have to remember, just because that was in the past doesn't mean that we have improved in this confederation. This is an inferior confederation to those. It stands discriminated from every other institution of a similar kind and exhibits a new and unexampled phenomenon in the political world. Mike, there have been improvements in political science, right? We learned about them in 9. Thank God. They're not here. We haven't practiced them in this confederation. And just because it's new, just because it's unexampled, doesn't mean it's improved. It's going to take this round of revision, he suggests, and suggests further on, to be able to bring to bear the improvements of political science.
Yeah, I read those words at the end of paragraph 2, new and unexampled phenomena in the political world, as an insult.
Those are not compliments.
That's not a compliment. That's like I had a teacher who would reply to something absurd that a student would utter. Oh, I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't looked at it that way. So anyway, this is Publius wielding his blade here against the existing order, and we're ready for it. The Articles of Confederation cannot make laws governing the entirety of the Union, which we must have in order to be safe against external powers. What about internal threats? How does the Articles of Confederation and the Union therein not guard against internal threats? If you look at paragraph 3 in Federalist 21, Publius says, the want of a mutual guarantee of the state governments is another capital imperfection in the federal plan. Okay, well, this language is weird. Don't worry about it. Here's the problem. There is no guarantee of Republican government inside of the states, and there is no power that exists that can make sure that state governments will not become tyrannies, that will not tyrannize over us, that will rob us of our liberty. So look, keep in mind, all of our concerns back in Federalist Papers 3 through 8 were concerns rooted in our love of liberty and our desire not to succumb to tyranny. And here Publius has said, look, you have state governments that cannot protect you against that. Your neighbor might become your master. There's no law that can save you because there's no federal government with teeth.
Which is helpful to say that the Constitution contains a guarantee of Republican government to the states. And it's not just that paper provision, as we'll see in paragraph number 4, contains the means to enforce it. Usurpation, he says, crest in each state and trample upon the liberties of the people, while the national government could legally do nothing more than behold its encroachments with indignation and regret. And the dangers come not only from a tyranny from the leaders, but also from an insurrection from the many.
Mm-hmm.
Who can determine what might have been the issue of Massachusetts' late convulsions if the malcontents had been headed by a Caesar or by a Cromwell? Not a Shays, but a Caesar or a Cromwell, right? A favorite of the people, actually talented, ambitious, resourceful enough to be able to overthrow the government of the states. Or what if it comes from the governors themselves? In any direction, whichever one you fear, whether you fear the people or whether you fear the great, a constitution with a guarantee of Republican government and the teeth to be able to enforce that guarantee will protect your liberty and your state sovereignty, I might add. So if you're desirous of maintaining and protecting your state sovereignty, you might need to give a little bit up to maintain the rest of it, which has been so much of our argument about union this whole way.
Publius is consistently teaching us, give up a little to get a little.
Yeah.
So if I can put a cap on this, the proposed Constitution and Union will guarantee Republican form of government within the states. The assumption here, therefore, is that the federal government, as proposed under the United States Constitution, can better secure us than can any state constitution. The next problem, and we're just going to push through these before we slow down at some of the stuff that we really want to chew on for a little bit. The next problem Publius discusses in Federalist Paper 21 are the problems of quotas. He says, the principle of regulating the contributions of the states to the common treasury by quotas is another fundamental error in the Confederation. Publius is going to use all sort of moral language throughout this. It's repugnant, all of this sort of stuff. And you got to keep in mind, taxation is an occupation of even the noblest of minds. So we fought this revolution. There was some sort of slogan about taxation I remember reading about somewhere, and we worry about it to this minute. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government may only request the money from the states. There's no guarantee that the states are going to give the money. What do you know? This issues from the lack of teeth and the lack of a constitutional power as well. So there's no express statement, and even if there were, there's nothing that the national government could do about it. So if there's no money, what sort of government is there? Earlier, we established, Aaron, that if you can't make law in the true sense, as something that's enforceable, as something that's obeyed, you're not government. If you don't have money and you can't operate, how are you a government? Raise troops and pay them? If you can't do that, you're not a government. Here we get somewhat interesting talk on taxes. Direct versus indirect taxation is discussed. Publius, of course, likes indirect taxation. Things like taxes on imports. He speaks of this in paragraph 8. Imposts, excises, and in general, all duties upon articles of consumption. That's the sort of taxation he likes. Because you don't want to pay taxes on it, don't buy it. If you recall, a handful of papers ago, Publius talked about a booze tax, a sin tax. You don't like paying taxes on your gas-guzzling Dodge Viper. Don't buy it. I think you should buy it, though, Aaron. I think you'd look great in that Viper. They don't make them anymore, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm noticing here there is not a full-throated case for a federal income tax.
No. In fact, you have to worry that something like a direct tax could be something like a head tax or a poll tax, and it would have no limit.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd need a fixed rule attached to keep it from being a tyrannical or overly burdensome direct tax. If government needs money in order to be government, how can you bind it in terms of the amount of money it can raise? Is a fixed rule on the extent of taxation, limiting of the powers that are needed for government to be good government, namely to have the power it needs to attain its ends? I think I'm right in what I'm getting at logically. There is no way you should be making that argument in Federalist Paper 21. You have to hope people aren't thinking about it that much, because this is scary stuff, and it's going to come in Federalist Paper 23, actually. So while it's scary, we're grown-ups, and Publius is going to talk to us about it very soon, but not yet. Here, it's about indirect taxes.
And even so, he says, in past, when the Articles of Confederation Congress had to make requisitions of the states for money, the proportion that each state was meant to pay, although it didn't often happen, was calculated from the value of the land. We're thinking about tyranny and about inequality. What he says in paragraph 8, the inequality between the states would of itself be sufficient in America to work the eventual destruction of the Union if any mode of enforcing a compliance with its requisitions could be devised. The suffering states would not long consent to remain associated upon a principle which distributed the public burdens with so unequal a hand, and which was calculated to impoverish and oppress the citizens of some states, while those of others would scarcely be conscious of the small proportion of the weight they were required to sustain. So these imposts, excises, and duties upon articles of consumption, these are going to be less onerous to the Union as a whole. These will be more stable. These will be safer, even though we're giving for the first time the federal government the power to build a tax relation with the individual. That's a major step in the relationship between the national government and the citizen. As we realized from the last conflict, that's a major avenue for oppression, for rebellion. But Publius says, and he makes this argument all the time, the current system is worse.
Do you feel comfortable real quickly just talking to us about Shays' Rebellion and what that was about?
Shays' Rebellion, Massachusetts farmers protesting land debts, seeking forgiveness for debts to holders in the city, made what historians today call a sort of minor uprising in Western Massachusetts that nonetheless managed to suspend the administration of justice, and most importantly, either scare the heck out of some of the founding fathers or at least provide them with a drum to beat. Shays, 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 which ultimately led not only to the calling of the convention, but also to some of the impetus behind reform.
I hope you can see why I asked that. Shays is spoken of back there in paragraph 4, and we see the dangers of direct taxation. Well, taxation was an aspect of Shays. We have to keep in mind that while the American Revolution had no taxation without representation as a slogan, to be sure, this isn't over with. It's going to continue to be a problem. What's funny is you said that this indirect taxation affords a more solid ground. I believe you used that language, solid ground, Aaron. Publius compares it to a fluid. You're right. I don't mean to argue against that. I just mean to say the way that a fluid levels out, the way that a fluid can spread and become, what's the way to say this? Placid. He says, Publius in paragraph 9 of Fed 21, if inequality should arise in some states from duties on particular objects, these will in all probability be counterbalanced by proportional inequalities in other states from the duties on other objects. In the course of time and things, an equilibrium as far as it is attainable in so complicated a subject will be established everywhere. Or, if inequalities should still exist, they would neither be so great in their degree, so uniform in their operation, nor so odious in their appearance as those which would necessarily spring from quotas upon any scale that can possibly be devised. So everyone's going to have a burden, and some might have more of an immediate burden than others. But Publius is here projecting that it will level out like water across a surface. But here's a little bit of political economy for you that's now bound with good government. Because the insurrections or rebellions or even tyrannical taxations that we might worry about because of direct taxation, Publius here is offering us a way out through indirect taxation.
Yeah, and what phrase appears thinking of political economy in this essay? The wealth of nations. And we've talked before about some of the influences on Publius, like Locke and Hobbes. And here, there comes the title from that famous book by Adam Smith.
Mm-hmm. Okay, would you mind turning to Fed 22 now?
Same subject continued, and at long last, doesn't say that, concluded.
Don't think we've seen in a title and concluded.
Yeah, we've been working through this since 15.
Yeah, golly. Yeah, sure have.
Pretty hard.
There's a lot in 22 that I think is quite interesting. Publius is continuing the same subject as Aaron says, and the next defect in the Articles of Confederation that he'd like to address is, quote, the want of a power to regulate commerce. The Articles of Confederation lack a power to regulate interstate commerce and intercontinental commerce. This is a problem because no nation acquainted with the nature of our political association would be unwise enough to enter into stipulations with the United States, conceding on their part privileges of importance, while they were apprised that the engagements on the part of the Union might at any moment be violated by its members. And while they found from experience that they might enjoy every advantage they desired in our markets without granting us any return, but such as their momentary convenience might suggest. I'm going to stop. So let's be very clear. Without a power regulating commerce, both between the states and between the United States and other nations, the market is irregular and unsteady, and people will not do business in an uncertain market. As I've said before, and I'll say again, no one plants a tree unless they think they're going to be there in a few years to enjoy the fruit of their labor. And so really, for commerce to warrant its name, there must be some power regulating it and keeping it steady. Now, this is not to say that there's not a free market or something like that, but it is to suggest that there has to be some regulation that exists between the states, according to Publius, in order for the states to do business with each other. Am I misunderstanding this argument, or does this seem right?
No, I would add you might have, you're going to have, if there are 13 states, you're going to have 13 different rules by which foreign powers have to play. But also, right, it's not just 13. The multiplicity of these laws, the constant changing of them is a problem as well, right? Creating one law for interstate commerce actually means law will be much more stable, right? Because the factions that associate within the states tugging back and forth for interest aren't going to operate with the same rapidity and frequency in the national government. So reducing to one rule of imposts, for example, will create much more stability than if you just said to the several states, hey, you guys can have 13 rules, but you can only change them every 5 or 10 years or something like that. So reducing this to one policy will create far more stability than even the arithmetic implies.
And all of this instability could lead to war. That's the other thing we have to see there, that not only is it not good for business, it's good for war. Look at the language Publius uses. This is paragraph 3 of Fed 22. Several states have endeavored by separate prohibitions, restrictions, and exclusions to influence the conduct of Great Britain in this particular, but the want of concert arising from the want of a general authority and from clashing and dissimilar views in the states has hitherto frustrated every experiment of the kind and will continue to do so as long as the same obstacles to a uniformity of measures continue to exist. And he goes on in the next paragraph. The interfering and unneighborly regulations of some states, contrary to the true spirit of the Union, have in different instances given just cause of umbrage and complaint to others. So that just cause of umbrage is not going to be so polite after a while. I think it's going to get pretty nasty. So you've got to have some way of solving disputes and routinizing or regularizing commercial affairs, especially when it comes to intercontinental commerce. And furthermore, how can we offer indirect taxes unless we also can regulate that commerce?
Right now, the states are complaining that the national government is being too unstable with regard to foreign trade. Right?
You're thinking tariffs right now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
The tariffs are rising and falling in 200% one day and back to 15% the next day in a way that's frustrating our allies, encouraging our adversaries, and blocking ourselves out from foreign markets. Now, the answer that Publius would give is, yeah, of course, the national government is going to be a lever for power in a way that can frustrate foreign markets. At the same time, wouldn't it be so much worse if California and Texas could create rules for themselves?
That's right. That's very helpful. Yeah. So imagine a multiplicity of sovereignties doing the same thing you're saying, and they would do it.
Even as the states will continue to use their power to try to court foreign goods. You can set up a carrier plant in Wisconsin, but you don't get to set the tariff rate.
So my point that the want of a power to regulate commerce is a very dangerous want because war is right around the corner, I think is admitted by Publius in the next subject, namely the power of raising armies. The problem now with the Articles of Confederation that Publius wants to address is that it cannot raise an army. He says the most obvious construction of the Articles of the Confederation is merely a power of making requisitions upon the states for quotas of men. Again, you're just asking for it. Hey, could we please have 2,000 troops to fight these Brits or put down this insurrection? It doesn't work. They can only ask. And so therefore the government's no government. It has no mechanism to enforce its laws, nor does it have a mechanism to keep the peace, to protect us against violent insurrections that may want to usurp our Republican form of government in this or that state. And then people start offering bounties. They start saying, hey, come enlist and we'll offer you this much money. And so then there's a competitive marketplace that's irregular for Aaron enlisting in the army. And Aaron's not going to want to enlist because he's bullish on the market and thinks that he's going to fetch another $5 tomorrow than he would today. And then in addition, Publius goes on to say, the states nearer to the seat of war are going to feel the necessity more than states which are further away. And the states which are further away are, he doesn't quite say free riding, but they're definitely like, hey, this isn't my problem. And so any sort of mutual guarantee that is to exist between the states for their security seems a little silly in the face of experience, or it seems false in the face of experience because of the difficulties of raising an army.
Yeah, the Virginia ratifying debates, Patrick Henry is going to ask Madison, what do you care about Shays' Rebellion, right? Mm-hmm. We live in Virginia. Mm-hmm. Publius says it's the wrong way to think about tyranny appearing in one part of the state. Even if Henry doesn't want a strong union, we have a union nonetheless. And a tyranny in Massachusetts, of course, that can extend. What if it creeps down to Connecticut, to New York, and so on? And he's rehearsed a kind of argument about this before, Publius has. We've seen how poorly a spirit of national unity, of pride, of anti-British vitriol managed to animate the cause for independence. People did not do their part. We see this all over the history of the American Revolution, whether it's in the organization of a national army after Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, as late as the Newburgh Conspiracy. Mike, which is something you and I enjoy talking about. It's just not simply enough for the national government to hold out their hands to the states, say, please, sir, can I have some more? And expect them out of goodwill, national pride, to comply. No, even in a matter as grave as this, you need to be able to use force.
Look at the language Publius uses in completing this point, in complete agreement with you, Aaron. The system of quotas and requisitions, whether it be applied to men or money, is, in every view, a system of imbecility in the Union and of inequality and injustice among the members. It's a system of injustice. That's remarkable. This is an unjust system. There's no way of making sure people pay their fair share, their equal share. And so some people will contribute more troops. Some people will contribute more money. We can't even really actually account for who's contributed, how many troops, and if they haven't contributed enough troops, what are we even going to do about it?
His invocation of equality in the sentence you read, Mike, leads to the next point, I think. The right of equal suffrage among the states is another exceptionable part of the Confederation. The Confederation Congress is structured so that each state can have 2 to 7 delegates, but only one voting member. That means that Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, Delaware have equal weight, equal voice in the Confederation Congress. We can imagine why that's a problem for several reasons. Rhode Island did hold up the national business and prevent good from being done. It's not simply about effective government. Effective government is not exhaustive of good government because we still have to care about Republican government. Its operation, he says, contradicts that fundamental maxim of Republican government, which requires that the sense of the majority should prevail. So he's aiming this point directly at the heart of the principle of state equality and representation in the national government. The voice of the majority, whether it's the majority of citizens across all the 13 states or the majority of states, need to prevail. And we see this embodied in the House of Representatives, but he's not ready to talk about that yet. Now, there's a reply, Wade, Mike. What is it?
Sophistry may reply that sovereigns are equal and that a majority of the votes of the states will be a majority of Confederated America. But this kind of logical legerdemain will never counteract the plain suggestion of justice and common sense. It may happen that this majority of states is a small minority of the people of America, and 2/3 of the people of America could not long be persuaded upon the credit of artificial distinctions and syllogistic subtleties to submit their interests to the management and disposal of 1/3. The larger states would, after a while, revolt from the idea of receiving the law from the smaller. To acquiesce in such a privation of their due importance in the political scale would be not merely to be insensible to the love of power, but even to sacrifice the desire of equality. It is neither rational to expect the first nor just to require the last, considering how peculiarly the safety and welfare of the smaller states depend on the Union. They ought readily to renounce a pretension which, if not relinquished, would prove fatal to its duration. I must confess, we should see that the fundamental maxim of Republican government, that the majority should prevail, is impossible in the existing Articles of Confederation, where you need 9/13 to do anything. We need a simple majority, and we're reminded here of these arguments, for instance, that Locke makes in Second Treatise of Government, Chapter 8, where he's establishing the Commonwealth and says, look, it takes a complete majority to form the Commonwealth. You consent to be governed. But once in that Commonwealth, you just need majoritarianism. And if you didn't accept that, given the variety of interests that human beings have, as well as the infirmities of health, it's really about the varieties of interest, you would be like Cato going into the theater only to exit again. So any of the sort of security that government means to bring about will be sacrificed on an expectation of complete majority or supermajority or equality between all members who should always get what they want. There has to be a principle that supersedes individual interests. I mean, the essential maximum of a Republican government, namely majoritarianism.
So neither good government nor Republican government is possible under the system we're learning. Justice and common sense, that sounds like good government. Fundamental maxim of Republican government, that's the other part. We're not done with this argument.
So if some people's vote counts more than others, then it's unrepublican, Publius says. Rhode Island and Massachusetts aren't the same. And it's an invitation to corruption. Everything is given to one human being's vote, to one man's vote. And it's also, therefore, a violation of equality, as one counts as much as 12 whenever we have to have all 13 states counting. So the fundamental rule of Republican government is majoritarian rule. It is to represent all, and we must see now it is to limit corruption. But whenever Rhode Island's vote counts as much as 12 other votes, or Massachusetts' vote counts as much as 12 other votes, you see a violation of that principle.
I'm not sure how much this is worth noting, but Madison's original plan, if we're thinking about the roots of these essays 21 and 22, and Madison's criticism of the Articles of Confederation, his original plan for the government had proportional representation in both the House and the Senate. And he suggested a bicameral legislature, yes, but it didn't follow the sort of compromise we see between the states and between the national populations. Majority rule of proportionally represented states was meant to carry the way. To give a minority a negative upon the majority, which is always the case where more than a majority is requisite to a decision, is in its tendency to subject the sense of the greater to that of the lesser. We saw that in Federalist number 10. That is not a maxim of Republican government. In Fed 10, how do you solve the problem of minority faction? Well, the Republican principle takes care of it. That has to be true within the state legislatures. It has to be true within the national government, and it has to be true across the extended sphere.
So the problem of equal suffrage, here's the problem of minority faction. The Articles of Confederation suffer from minority faction. To ascribe to it the problems of minority faction means that Massachusetts, for instance, or Rhode Island, for instance, means to act against the permanent and aggregate interests of the community or the rights of others, which may not be the case. But the point here is that the Republican principle is stymied by the minority. And the last time we saw that was in Fed 10 with minority faction.
Well, it's certainly the case that the amendability of the Articles of Confederation, because Rhode Island can act against the permanent and aggregate interest of the community in delaying any kind of amendment, preventing any kind of amendment, requires the step outside of normal procedure that the Constitutional Convention makes, right? And you only have to do it once.
It's worth pointing out here that it takes all 13 states to amend the Articles of Confederation as opposed to a supermajority.
Unanimity, right?
Yeah.
It
takes everyone, all 13.
And thinking about how we can arrive from this system, the Articles of Confederation, at good government, at Republican government, he doesn't make the point here, but it strengthens his argument to note that to amend the Articles of Confederation in any material way required not a majority, not a supermajority, but unanimity among the states. So if we're thinking about why we had to take this extraordinary measure of calling a constitutional convention to reform and then replace the Articles of Confederation, well, we're setting up a new amendability process whereby one state cannot arrest needful improvements that maybe, let's say in the language of Federal 10, are in the permanent aggregate interests of the community. A faction should not be able, according to common sense, according to justice, according to good government, be able to prevent those kind of modifications to a dangerous and poor plan.
The next want that Publius goes on to describe in the Articles of Confederation is the want of a judicial power. He says, laws are a dead letter without courts to expound and define their true meaning and operation. And he goes on to discuss from this the treaties of America. In so few words, you need a judicial power in the Articles of Confederation that can solve all disputes, interpret all treaties, interpret all laws, instead of having a series of independent judiciaries within each state. Now, it's worth pointing out at this point, the Articles of Confederation is just Congress. There is no separate judiciary. There is no separate executive. There is no separation of powers. There is no bicameralism in the Articles of Confederation. And here, starting in paragraph 14 of Federalist Paper number 22, Publius outlines the problems of not having a separate judiciary. Here's the thrust of it. There are endless diversities in the opinions of men. So how are you ever going to get anything done? How are you ever going to make any decisions? There are endless diversities in the opinions of men. And we know from our study of the Federalist Papers, people have different interests. Interests and opinions combine and enforce each other. How are you going to solve disputes? How are you going to decide what this law actually says or interpret this treaty? You must establish one tribunal paramount to the rest, possessing a general superintendence and authorized to settle and declare in the last resort a uniform rule of civil justice. So without uniform rule, without uniform law, without uniform power, you exist in a state of uncertainty. The union is needed in order to keep us safe from without and from within. But then in addition, you must have a federal government that's capable of governing that union. It must have certain features and certain powers. We can see the power to tax, the power to raise troops, the power to enforce laws. That's what we've been working on. We also must see now that it has a certain feature, a judiciary that's capable of what? Deciding matters of interstate commerce. Whenever a law is made and then states are unhappy about it, there needs to be a judiciary that can settle that stuff. And this opens us up now to Publius's implicit argument for separation of powers here. Mm-hmm. This was one of the 5 improvements Publius offered us in Federalist Paper number 9. Now, legislative checks and balances, we have to keep in mind that's bicameral legislature, but Publius announces there are also separate spheres of government. He says an independent judiciary serving with tenure. And that's what he's arguing here. He's developing another component of his improved political science on the back of the weakness or failures of the Articles of Confederation. Yeah. And we can understand the need for that judiciary now, not merely in terms of liberty-securing government wrought by a separation of power schema, no matter if you're thinking of Montesquieu Book 11 of The Spirit of Laws, or if you're thinking of Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, Query 13. Not merely that argument. Now you realize you need a judiciary that hangs over all of the other decisions that are going to be made inside of the states. So what is this now? There's some sort of federalism that we're witnessing. Because Publius could just say you got to get rid of all of those courts, but he doesn't go that far. He just says you need a tribunal paramount to the rest, possessing a general superintendence. So there still will be courts inside the states, but you need an overcourt. You need a federal court.
Yeah, why, he says, the faith, the reputation, the peace of the whole union are continually at the mercy of the prejudices, the passions, and the interests of every member of which these are composed. Is it possible that foreign nations can either respect or confide in such a government? Is it possible that the people of America will longer consent to trust their honor, their happiness, their safety on so precarious a foundation? It must be by this time evident to all men of reflection, who are either free from erroneous prepossessions or can divest themselves of them, that it is a system. The Articles of Confederation is a system so radically vicious and unsound as to admit not of amendment, but by an entire change in its leading features and characters. And Mike, that sounds like a summary of the prior papers, but he's not done.
No, he's not done. I want to point out something too. So much of these things we just read remind me of other things, of course. Trust their honor, their happiness, their safety. I don't know. I just start hearing the end of the Declaration of Independence with lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. But also this last bit you read to us, Aaron, that the Articles of Confederation is a system so radically vicious and unsound as to admit not of amendment, but by an entire change in its leading features and characters. That is Washington's letter to Madison, March 31st, 1787. Yeah. Washington says the following, talking about going to Philadelphia and so forth. He says, Washington says, I am anxious to know how this matter really is, as my wish is that the convention may adopt no temporizing expedient, but probe the defects of the Constitution to the bottom and provide radical cures, whether they are agreed to or not. A conduct like this will stamp wisdom and dignity on the proceedings and be looked to as a luminary, which sooner or later will shed its influence. So Don't adopt any temporizing expedient, says Washington there. And Publius here said, you can't temporize with this stuff. That wonderful Machiavellian word, temporize. You can't just make do with this and accommodate it. This thing is rotten to the core. This thing is weak in all of these ways, feeble. It's a nuisance. It's unjust. It's vicious. It's unsound.
At the same time, we're not going to replace it with something, to use the language of number 21 that we've discussed already, new and unexampled. And this is going to be founded on a political science based in the great oracle experience. We're not visionaries. We're not projectors.
Publius isn't done by just saying, look, it's vicious and unsound and you can't amend it to fix it. Well, we've already discussed the problem of offering an amendment to the Articles of Confederation, but also it's so rotten that you can't fix it. It's a teardown, as they would say today. But Congress is in need of great alteration. Were you to give Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, the powers it needs to make a union worth its name, to make good government, its feebleness would have it fall apart, or the accumulation of additional powers would find it possessing all of the prerogatives of sovereignty and become one of the, quote, most execrable forms of government that human infatuation ever contrived. So if you were to continue to apply new powers on top of the existing Articles of Confederation, it would either tumble and fall apart, or it would just become tyranny. And again, to repeat, there is no separation of powers in the Articles of Confederation, nor is there bicameralism. So Publius now, I've already suggested, is implying the necessity of separation of powers, is implying legislative checks and balances, the need for a separate Senate from the House. We need two chambers. We need to slow this government down in some ways and have it check itself because it must have this amount of power. So here's the conundrum, and it's one that Publius is going to wrestle with for so many more papers. How can you give this government the power that it has to have to keep us safe and also keep us safe from that government? Keep that government from itself becoming tyrannical. Do you simply just go the direction of the anti-feds and kneecap that government and say it can't have that much power and anybody who has power has to be right down the street from me and I need to know them? That is to say, local government. And it's therefore kept responsible in that way, and that's the only way to safeguard liberty? Publius has here rejected that understanding on the basis of the insufficiency of the Union under the present Constitution.
Which is to say, he also makes the case for why this could not be amended in the Articles of Confederation. The institution itself would have an interest in not splitting itself up and accruing to itself all of this power.
Yeah.
That is their interest.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah, that's a good point.
And the ultimate result is that we will balance, as you say, if we're avoiding the government from moldering it to pieces and of turning into a tyranny, we need to balance stability and liberty.
Two of the main four components of good government there, Aaron. So you have this problem of even appealing to the state legislatures. And let's turn, if we can, now to the final paragraph of Federalist Paper 22, please. This is a wonderful argument for Republican government, really helping the full shape of Republican government come to sight for us. The Articles of Confederation were never ratified by the people. They were ratified by the states. And here it seems that the states could pull another state out of the Union by de-ratifying the Articles. It's all contingent upon the state legislatures, not the people. Publius says the Articles rest on no better foundation than the consent of the several legislatures. It's been exposed to frequent and intricate questions concerning the validity of its powers and has, in some instances, given birth to the enormous doctrine of a right of legislative appeal. So this is another way of thinking about Chapter 8 of Locke's Second Treatise of Government. You can't just repeal this whole government on a whim. Once you're in, you're in. And if it's a law that you don't care for, you have to grit your teeth and bear it and try and change that law. If the government is doing things that you don't like, you have to grit your teeth and bear it and try and alter it into things that you do like. But you can't just move out of the Union because you want to. The Union itself cannot stand for that. Let me say this very clear in case everything I'm saying is so off-putting. Can you pick and choose which laws you follow? What happens if you do that? What becomes of law? Can you pick and choose when it is that you're a member of the Union? When it is that you're a part of the United States? I want to change, actually, the way I'm doing business with Great Britain, you say. Well, wait a minute. All of the arguments for the necessity of the Union show us the problem of this sort of independent judgment making within the states, independent of the others, independent of their neighbors, independent of the whole of which we seemingly are a part. So no government can allow its citizens to decide which laws they do and do not follow. They must follow them all. Just the same as no union can allow its members to decide whether on a lark they are a member of that union. And when it comes down to it, if you have to make an appeal to heaven, that's right. You have to make an appeal to heaven. But it can't just be by way of the legitimacy of the sovereignty enjoyed by each of the states as the ratifier of the Articles of Confederation. You can't wrap yourself in the cloak of that sovereignty. I don't care if you're from South Carolina. You can't do that. Always got to work in the dig at South Carolina, Aaron.
Yeah, so submitting this to a ratification has the further effect of binding together the Union in a way that makes state nullification or secession or this like sort of odd relationship where you have a relationship to the foreign power that the other states don't have. It makes that much less excusable.
Well, and it makes it also immoral. It shows that the states behaving in this way would be immoral because it would be anti-Republican. So go ahead, excuse me.
It's not simply founded upon a new relationship between the states and the national government, which it is. It's also founded on a new relationship between the people of the states and the national government. The fabric of American empire, the fabric of American empire ought to rest on the solid basis of the consent of the people. The streams of national power ought to flow immediately from that pure original fountain of all legitimate authority. That's a new relationship.
Yeah. And Publius here has fully taken the fight to the anti-federalists. The articles are anti-Republican. The people never ratified them, only the legislatures. And if the legislatures can approve them, then they can unapprove them. If all it takes is the will of of a state legislature to get us in, it only takes the will of a state legislature to get us out. Publius's answer, therefore, is a refounding on new grounds. Those new grounds are the will of the people, the consent of the people, the pure original fountain of all legitimate authority. You know, anytime we see that fountain, Publius doesn't speak that way often, but the other big place where he speaks that way is Fed 49, when Publius is talking about constitutional amendment there in that section. These words are ones worth really marking down and paying attention to. So we have to refound on a new ground, and that ground is the consent of the people themselves. That is a Republican ground, truly. So it's not only safer, but it's more Republican. So it's not only going to keep you safer, it's more moral, I would argue. So the construction, therefore, of this new Constitution is going to come about in the ensuing papers. Most importantly, Fed 23 is about to happen. And there we're going to understand the necessity of energetic government. When you see how much energy this government is going to have, you see how much energy it must have in order to make the Union solid and own up to its promise of safety. We could keep in mind these closing paragraphs of 17 and 18 in Federalist Paper number 22 regarding the insufficiency of the Articles of Confederation. Because once you start heaping that power on it, the whole structure is either going to buckle or become tyrannical. Therefore, you must rebuild the structure on a new foundation and with new institutions. That foundation, the consent of the people, new institutions, a separation of power schema with a supreme judiciary over all of the lesser judiciaries in each of the states, to be sure, a bicameral legislature, and in Fed 23 in particular, a separate executive. What do you think of Federalist Papers 21 and 22 now that we're wrapping them up here, Aaron?
Knowing what's to come of the argument for a strong federal government in number 23, I can really see the sequence that Publius is building, right? We're showing this government is more safe. We're showing at the end that this government is more Republican. right? And in a way that is, I think, really meant to convince people who are concerned that this is a monarchical, tyrannical thing, or that the Articles of Confederation just provides a safer government. So, in the rhetorical movement between papers, it's very impressive to think about the plan. Does Publius conceive of 23 and then realize the legwork he has to do to get there? Or does he, after writing 21 and 22, think, all right, I'm ready to pull out the big one?
Yeah.
But I guess that's giving a little bit away of what we'll talk about next time.
Let me ask you a question before we go. So legerdemain is a $5 way of saying like sleight of hand, correct? Something like this. Publius's argument at the end of Fed 22 that not the people, but the state legislatures ratified the Articles of Confederation, therefore means that the Articles of Confederation exist on a other than or less than Republican basis. How did those state legislatures come into being? Except by the consent of the governed. And Publius has leaned on representative government. Representative government is good. It's a key feature of Republican government. You have to keep in mind that of the two cures that Publius offers to control the effects of majority faction, one of them is representation. The other is enlarging the sphere. But here, that representation that one enjoys in the state legislatures is done away with. It's not mentioned. Let me see if I can state this more clearly. I think I tried to say it in too complex a manner. The state legislatures are there because I put them there. So they are my representative. And they voted to do this thing, the Articles of Confederation. How does that mean that the Articles of Confederation exist on grounds other than my consent? Because he needs it to be direct consent? It seems as if maybe in the formation of something like government, consent is needed from each individual. But here's a problem. What if I don't vote to ratify the United States Constitution? And if I'm still thinking here about Locke's Second Treatise, Chapter 8, of what it takes to form a commonwealth, and then the way that lawmaking must occur inside the commonwealth, there's no way out of this problem. So, let me be very succinct. Is Publius doing a sleight of hand with this argument against the Articles of Confederation as founded on the consent from the state legislatures and not the consent of the people themselves? Is that a bad argument?
Yeah. I mean, so in some ways, the states are going to complain that it is reaching through the states toward the American people. But he does argue, at least as far as the tax relation goes, that it's a necessary step, right? This government, to be good government, for stability, energy, to be able to maintain liberty, has to be able to collect taxes from the people. Whether or not you think that ratification must proceed from the people, you would have to agree on that. So now, right, this Confederation Congress did not heretofore operate on the people or with the consent of the people. To be able to have this new government with the power to tax people, a new relationship, a new political relationship with the people is needed. So it is that direct relationship of taxation. We think again how important taxation is as a subject of government in the late 18th century in continental America and in the United States, requires a new relationship toward the people that only ratification by the people and state conventions can allow. I mean, this legitimacy problem is a huge issue. If a constitution as a fundamental law is different than, let's say, statutory law, it has to have a different origin of consent. This seems to be a way to create a new kind of consent for a new kind of government. And the powers of the Continental Congress endow this government with seem to necessitate going directly to the people, asking them, are you okay with being taxed with something like this, with seeking consent directly therefrom?
Yeah, but aren't we also going to just elect electors? Like, it's not going to be a direct ratification vote necessarily. Like, it's not mandated as such. So we could still have a representative voting for this. I feel as if the closing argument, as powerful as it is legerdemain. I feel as if it's sophistry. It sure does move me. I want to ratify this thing, and I didn't ratify that thing. What's interesting about that closing argument in Fed 22 is that by way of saying that the state legislatures and not the people ratified the Articles of Confederation, the state legislatures and not the people are to blame for the failures, the faulty construction of the Articles of Confederation. And that makes me feel better, because if you're sitting here going, and guess what? You made all of these mistakes. I would probably get a little resistant. But what I now do, because of what this argument now is getting me to do, is to see actually that the state legislatures might not be as wise as they should be. They might not be as deserving of my trust as the anti-feds would say. Because if they made these mistakes regarding the Articles of Confederation, what else are they going to do? I mean, I hadn't thought about this closing argument that way. What happens when you place the blame there? It absolves me of the blame. And what Publius is doing also is empowering me and saying that the true fountain of power here is in the people's consent. That's interesting. Aaron, it's time to build some energetic government in the ensuing Federalist Papers. We're rounding out a section here, by the way. It'll come to the last part of the first part of the book. We're now arriving there. So while we had to grind through a lot of these papers on the Union, on understanding confederacies and unions and the necessity of having a strong union under a federal head, we're now ready to understand the necessity of energy, because we don't like feeble government. We want energetic government with teeth. And that's where we are in the third section, the last part of the first part of the book. It's fun to talk that way. So look forward to seeing you again soon. We have more work to do.
Thank you very much. Talk soon.
This has been the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpauir.